thanks so much to Chuck Levins and Adam for having us here. It's really cool to have this kind of community. You know, I'm in New York, so coming down here and seeing that the modular scene is really alive down here is really great. My name's Nick. I'm a sound designer and product developer with Korg, and I developed some of the sounds and the user interface for the Minilogue XD. So if you were to pick up a Minilogue XD today, Chuck Levins, some of my sounds would be in there, which I get a kick out of because, you know, when I started, I had all of my favorite presets that just sound designers of years past had done, and now I get to make them. So I want to share some of those with you. But first, let's kind of go over the Minilogue XD in general. It's a Minilogue, so it's 4 voices of polyphonic analog. And if you're familiar with the original Minilogue, that came out in 2016. And 2 oscillator per voice, pretty standard subtractive synth, knob per function, at a price point that's really great. So it kind of opened up analog synths and polyphonic synths to musicians that may not have had you know, access to a synth before. And the Minilogue XD is the continuation of that series. There's also the Monologue and the Prologue, which are also really great synthesizers. And I think you can see them all at Chuck Levins in the Korg section, and also some of them are out today. But XD adds something new that first appeared on the Korg Prologue, and that's the multi-engine. So in the oscillator section, you have your standard VCOs, which start with a saw wave. And I'm on a initialized program, or init program to start out, which is just a gated saw wave. So you have that, and then you have a triangle wave. And then you have octave control, and a square or pulse wave. And each of these VCOs, that's voltage-controlled oscillators, so they're totally analog. And this is a totally analog synth until I bring in the digital oscillator, which I'll get to in a minute. They have shape control on the oscillators. So that's a continuous wave shaping tool that in saw will essentially kind of fold the wave in on itself. And in triangle, we'll do the same thing. So I don't know if you guys can see on the screen to my right, or to you guys' left, there's a oscilloscope on here, and that's something that's common to all of the Korg log synths. And that shows you kind of what you're doing to your sound as you're doing it. So if I wave shape this triangle wave, you can see the wave fold in on itself. If I filter something out, you can see the effect of that on the oscilloscope. And then, of course, the shape control is pulse width modulation when you're in square or pulse wave. And then if you turn that all the way up, the duty cycle will be 0, so you won't hear anything. And it's really fun to do something like modulate that with an LFO. So if I bring up the intensity of that, and I can use my target switch, set it to shape, turn the rate down, mode to normal. Let's do some triangle wave modulation. And I'm going to bring this intensity up, and you're going to hear the pulse width modulation. Just take the edge off a little bit with the filter. Now it kind of sounds like a vintage 70s, 80s string machine, like we're making like krautrock or something with, I don't know, a vintage like RS-09, something like that. That's a really nice like LFO modulated pulse wave sound with that pulse width modulation. It gets even fatter if I bring in a second oscillator and also have that on pulse width modulation. I can detune those against each other. Just get a really fat sound if I want to go for a bass. And then the third oscillator is, of course, the multi-engine. And the multi-engine is first appeared on the Korg Prologue, and it's a digital oscillator that has 3 different modes. So I'm going to just click to another initialized program, so I reset my sound. So remember, if you're working on a sound on any of the log synths, and probably just a lot of synths in general, you switch to another sound without saving it, you're going to lose that. So I want to use that as just a reset. So now I'm on my gated saw wave again. I'm going to turn down both of the analog oscillators, the VCOs, for now, and I'm going to turn the multi-engine up in the mixer, this section right here. And it starts off as noise, and there's a couple different types of noise in here. The first, of course, is a high-pass noise. So if I use the shape knob, that same shape knob that's on both the VCOs, that has a couple different functions in the multi-engine. I can high-pass that noise. And that'd be really useful for creating, I don't know, a hi-hat sound. So If I go in the sequencer, right? And now I can modulate aspects of that envelope using the sequencer, go into motion mode, which is really fun. Bring in a little bit more decay here. So I'm well on my way to creating a beat, but let's reset again, because I'm going to take you guys through a couple of the other multi-engine modes. So that's the noise. There's high pass. There's low pass. We do like filter sweeps. That's fun to add some reverb to and pretend you're at, I don't know, Electric Forest or one of those music festivals that are like, and you got your big build up there for your drop. Then there's a peaking noise, which is basically a peaking filter, kind of get some comb filtering in there. And I still have that reverb enabled, just for reference. That actually changes depending on where on the keyboard I'm pressing a note. You get your sound effects that way. And then my personal favorite in the noise section is the bit crush noise. So sounds really, really gnarly, and I love using that for percussive sounds as a sound source and then just messing around with that. So let's reset again, back to initialize sound. And the second section in the multi-engine is the VPM. And VPM is a way that waves and single cycles of waves are stored in digital storage on here, actually in the BIOS memory of the processors in Minilogue XD. So it's a very small amount of sound information that's looped because it's a single cycle of a wave. And you have things like a sine, and then you can wave shape that, and this is going to get pretty crazy because it's digital wave shaping. And what that essentially is a FM algorithm. You can kind of imagine it as that. Not quite as complicated as, say, a DX synth or something like that from back in the days of FM, but you're actually changing the way the operators and the algorithm functions, and there's two ways to do that. First I did it with the shape knob. I'm actually going to drop the octave a little bit. So it sounds pretty gnarly. I'm just going to give it a little bit of reverb to put us in a space here. So there's two ways to do that, and the shape knob is one. And then if I press shift and then move the shape knob, I actually have a completely different way to do that. So that's the ratio. So I have two dimensions. So instead of just having one continuously wave shapeable wave, I have a different range of sounds that I can get depending on what ratio offset is what it's called that I'm in. So I can use shift, change the shape to, let's go to a 4:1 ratio offset, and now I have a completely different range of sonic palettes that I can get out of this oscillator. So a lot of fun stuff to do with the multi-engine, and there's 16 separate waveforms in here. So let's reset again, let's bring up our multi-engine, VPM mode, and I have a couple different sines, and they kind of affect, the shape affects the sine wave in different ways. And then you have your digital modeled waveforms, so a saw wave that you might get on an analog synth. And then that allows you to actually have 3 saw waves going in unison. So if I bring up VCOs 1 and 2, which are by default on saw wave, I have 3 saw waves going in unison, but because this is the analog realm and we want to bring in some of our engineered imperfection, let's detune them a little bit. So we can get really fat basses that way with those 3 saw waves going in unison. And then there's a couple other waveforms in the multi-engine. And those include square waves, where instead of pulse width modulating, I'm actually folding the waveform in a digital way. And then there's a couple ones that just are totally out of this world. So this one's really great for using for basses. Sounds really good if I add in a little bit of just big reverb. And it sounds even cooler if I use the drive switch. This is a 50% drive. waveforms in here. I'm going to turn off my drive, get my cutoff and resonance back to reset. I have the air waveform, which is a little bit of white noise, so I can bring that in. So you can blend white noise with a little bit of a sine wave to get some kind of percussive, but at the same time tonal stuff. And then a couple like DX style kind of FM operator algorithms. It's your digital piano, fans of like DX7, classic 80s sounds. And then there's a couple more. So there's a lot of sonic range in here. The other section, the third section that I haven't gotten to yet, is the user section. This is really the most exciting part of the Korg multi-engine that's on both the Prologue and the Minilogue XD, and is going to be on some synths that are coming out very soon. I don't know if anybody's keeping up, but we just showed a prototype called the New Tech, which is a tiny little synth kit that you can actually build yourself, and that has this multi-engine oscillator on here. So all of these multi-engine oscillators, which we have for free online, are just compatible with all these synths. So you can go from multi-engine on your XD to your Prologue to your New Tech. And a really cool thing that I'm seeing is kind of the cross-pollination of the Eurorack world with our oscillators. Now I've seen the mutable instruments like plates and I believe braids have actually been ported to the multi-engine on the Korg XD and Prologue. So you can get those on here if those are your favorite oscillators. And if you know a little bit of code or you download a utility online, you can actually make your own. So my pet project is porting some vintage synth sounds to my XD using the multi-engine. I got some M1 sounds on my personal one at home, and I'm getting like the slap bass from the Seinfeld theme song, which is really fun. And so the multi-engine is really powerful, but just out of the box it has this really beautiful morphing wavetable oscillator, and I'm going to bring in a little bit of attack and release so I can show you guys what you can do with this. Oscillator on Minilogue XD. So that's kind of the sound sources that you have to choose from. So you got a ton of stuff that you can kind of morph into other things using the rest of the signal path. So we started with the gated saw wave, right? When we reset our sound. That of course, like most subtractive synths, goes straight into a analog filter, and that's a low pass 2-pole with gain compensation, so I can get some really nice low end. And we actually put in a drive switch similar to the Prologue, so you can overdrive that signal going in. So you get that squelch that you would need for making like an acid bass line, right? So if I go over my sequencer section, I can go and put in a simple bass line. So it doesn't sound like much yet, but we're going to put in a little bit of modulation of the filter with the envelope and kind of get to a little bit of kind of an acidy style bass line. So the way that we do that is not by modulating the filter by hand, which we can do and do some nice filter sweeps, say if we're playing live and our sequencer is going, but let's add in a little bit of envelope modulation of the filter cutoff. The way I do that is by targeting the cutoff over here and slowly bringing the envelope generator intensity knob right here up. If I bring in some effects, so we're already in Ibiza, right? So that's a little bit of simple sequencing, but something the Minilogue XD brings that is a kind of building on the original Minilogue, which had a great sequencer, 16 steps, polyphonic. You could divide up the steps, you could do all sorts of motion sequencing. That motion sequencing has been even bumped up a level in the Minilogue XD. So on the original Minilogue, you had 4 rows of motion sequencing. So if I pressed record and moved 4 different knobs, 2 at a time because I only have 2 hands, but then I did it again and moved 2 other knobs, I would have 4 different rows of automation. I'm automating my parameters. We bumped that up a level by making it so that you can change parameters per step. So immediately change a parameter. And what that gives us is, if I pull up, this is one of the sounds that I designed for Minilogue XD. It's a preset, it's on all of them. I have rows of motion. Can you guys see the screen pretty well on this, this TV?
We can see it, we can't really read it.
That's okay. I mean, we're looking at the shapes, so you can kind of see that instead of smooth motion curves, there's very quick motion changes, and that allows me to do things by modulating more than just parameters on the synth, but actually modulating the voice mode. So I'm turning the arpeggiator on and off, and that sounds like this. So if I turn all my motion off, see, I'm in motion mode and I just pressed all those buttons, it sounds like this. So what's being motion sequenced here is a variety of things. So the voice mode that I mentioned before is the arpeggiator, and I'm also motion sequencing the LFO, so that ba-ba-ba-ba, that's actually an LFO modulation that's synced to tempo, because on the LFO we actually have a BPM mode. So what that gives us is, if I go back to a blank sound, we can use the LFO to do divisions of tempo. So if I bring up, exit out of motion mode, bring up the LFO intensity, and bring down my cutoff, I have different divisions. So instead of just a rate and a percentage, I actually have 16th note, 8th note, 12th note if you want triplets, all the way up to 64th note if you're getting really crazy. And that can all be modulated by the sequencer. So what I want to do is do a kind of a cool thing where I incorporate a little bit of percussion into a chordal pattern. So I'm going to record a quick sequence by first going into sequence edit on a completely blank program. We're going to start with our gated saw wave and change my step resolution to, let's say, quarter note for now. So each of these steps in the 16-step sequencer is going to be a quarter note relative to my tempo, which I have a knob for over here. And I'm going to turn my gate time all the way up. That means for every single note, the gate, the note for the envelope is going to be open the entire time. So I'm going to exit out of there, and let's record, let's see. So that's my first step. I recorded 4 notes at once. Jazzy there at the end. So what that sounds like, I'm going to have my hand right in the tempo knob so I get the right tempo that I want. So that's my whole chord progression, and I can use that division of tempo to even divide it even more. So I have each of those steps is a half note now. So I brought the cutoff a little bit down, and then I'm going to bring in some resonance. And I can use some envelope modulation on that filter. And you can kind of imagine like kind of a beat going under that, and just you're already kind of in jazz territory. But I'm going to turn that attack down. And I'm BPM mode on the LFO, and this is my beat syncable LFO. So I have divisions of tempo. And that's a triangle shape right now, but I'm going to turn that to saw wave shape. Right? So I'm already kind of faking kind of having more than 16 steps, right? Because each of those steps is going to go for a whole half note. And I can change the rate of that. Triplets. So I actually want to, I think, go to eighth note. And I'm actually going to go back to quarter note because I kind of have an idea. So if you guys will accompany me on this sonic journey, we're going to add a kick and we're going to add a snare to this sound. It's going to be really fun. So let's see. So I'm actually going to redo that sequence because I want to have only an 8-step sequence. So I'm going to do 2 steps of each of those chords. So. Let's try that again. So now that sequence sounds like this. So we got our groove going. Now let's add in a little bit of cutoff modulation, but to create a kick and a snare. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is on our on every third note out of the 16, we're going to put in some modulation, some motion that brings in more of the multi-engine, which right now is on noise. So I'm going to select these steps, and you see how I'm just editing the steps that I'm holding down in the motion sequencer? That's that step-based editing, right? This is the feature that we added on top of what the Minilogue already has. So I'm going to bring it up to about here for each of those steps. So that's kind of sounding cool, but one thing that we also want to do is bring the resonance down for those steps, because when we have resonance going, that's kind of giving us a wow, wow. We want to get rid of that just for the snare. So. That's kind of sounding pretty cool. So I'm actually going to, and creating this, we're creating it on the spot. I don't really have an exact direction, but I have kind of like a vibe in mind that I'm going for. So I'm going to kind of try a couple different things. And let's turn that resolution to 1/8 and just see how that sounds. Now let's turn it back. I like it the way it was. There we go. Cool. So now let's add in our kick. So because we're doing that modulation, the kick is going to be, I think, a double kick. And I'm going to exit out of my sequence editing, and I'm going to bring in, let's see, bring in some resonance on these steps. Oops. Go into motion mode, bring in some resonance on these steps, and bring the cutoff down on those steps. So that's going to add in a new motion row. So let's just listen to how that sounds so far. Okay, so that's kind of cool. I don't want to have my chords all the way dropped out for those steps, so I'm going to bring the resonance down a little bit and bring the cutoff up a little bit. And let's hear how that sounds, because this is all about kind of trial and error and finding the correct sound for our kick. So it's a little bit too high on the cutoff. Let's bring that down a little bit. So now let's 2 more kicks, actually 3 more. Let's add in these 3 steps. Let's turn that resonance up to the same level as the other kick steps, and turn the cutoff down to the same level as the other kick steps. So that's going to sound like this. So you can play around with that. You can kind of get any vibe that you want. What I'm going to try now is bringing in some delay to kind of flesh out that sound. I'm going to exit out of my motion mode, and let's get a stereo BPM delay. And when I'm in this BPM mode, just like on the LFO BPM mode, I have divisions of tempo. So let's try a eighth note delay and see how that sounds. So that's actually kind of muddy in the bottom end, but I like the tempo of that delay, so I'm going to change that to a high pass BPM delay that's going to high pass out all of the lows that are in the repeats on this delay. So that's kind of a cool vibe, right? We're cultivating this vibe, and we can do other things with the envelopes on here. So for example, let's add in a little bit of cutoff modulation on the envelope generator that's controlling the cutoff. So now I think the last finishing touch is just a little bit of reverb on the master bus. So let's see. I'm kind of envisioning a little bit of a spacey reverb on here, but not too big. So let's go with room to turn the time up. There's different reverb types, right? So I cycled through, there's some halls, there's some smaller room reverbs, there's a plate, spring, and then there's some nonlinear reverbs like a riser, which is kind of like a shimmer verb, subreed, which is kind of like a subverb. And with that reverb, I can bring that up. And now I'm pretty happy with that. What do you guys think? It's good. I'm going to add that to my saved sounds by pressing right, and then I can select a slot, scroll to whatever slot I want to save that to. It doesn't really matter, so I'm just going to save it to the same slot I started in. Press right. Now that's saved. I can go to another sound, right? Play the sound again, and then go back to 478. I think is where I saved it. Right? So that's a really cool feature if you're just messing around with your Minilogue XD. You have a chord sequence or something like that, and you want to add in a little bit of drums and snare. Now, I'm not saying that, with a Minilogue XD you don't need a drum machine, because literally everybody needs a drum machine. It's like Fatboy Slim, everybody needs a 303, but everybody also needs a drum machine. So at this point, I want to take some requests for